So this cultivation of the momentum of mindfulness is, as we've been talking about in this particular style of practice, the momentum of mindfulness is where the concentration, where the stability of mindfulness creates that samadhi. And so the how we make effort, the kind of noticing the momentum of mindfulness, all of this supports the building of that momentum. In terms of our daily lives, I've talked a lot about the moment of mindfulness returning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that moment in just a minute. But that's a great place to begin to recognize the awareness and to get familiar with the awareness so that we can begin to notice the momentum of awareness also. In our daily lives, I'd say another support for continuity, maybe paradoxically, is to begin to be curious about where mindfulness goes, where it's just not here at all. You may notice that there are some places or times of the day that there's mindfulness feels more accessible, maybe in your kitchen or when you're doing your morning routine or something. Maybe it's not steady or completely mindful through the whole time, but there's more popping in of the awareness from time to time. Maybe you notice that return of mindfulness in making a meal, like, a whole bunch of times in the 15-20 minutes you're in the kitchen. So just notice that that's an indication of some level of momentum, because it's like not so far away. You're noticing the return of mindfulness, and often it doesn't even feel that much of a shift. It's kind of more like there is a level of mindfulness there, but it's just not quite really at the level of really meeting the experience and knowing that we're aware and what we're aware of. But there are definitely places and times of the day where we tend to get completely lost. And I'd encourage kind of maybe taking inventory, maybe a couple of times in the day, of like, think back over the last few hours. Where did I completely lose it? And this is not to be judgmental. It's more to, again, it's like noticing the absence of something. It's a different way of noticing the absence. You're noticing the absence of mindfulness there, noticing where mindfulness was not happening. And when we notice that, we may start to notice some patterns or some places or ways or times where the conditions of our minds or the conditions of what we're doing tend to have caught us, tend to have, caught the mindfulness so that it's not as available. So when we kind of get a sense of those places and times where mindfulness is less available, then we can begin to kind of create some interest, create a sense of, okay, I know that I tend to lose my awareness as soon as I walk out the door, or I notice I lose my awareness as soon as the phone rings, something like that. So just where do we notice that we lose awareness? I notice I lose awareness as soon as my boss walks into my office, just things like that. Just begin to be curious about that. Or maybe you notice you lose awareness when a particular mind state arises, or a particular kind of pattern of thought, like an argument with your boss, or an argument about a particular topic with your partner, that you see you get lost in those kind of mind states. And so when you notice the areas where you tend to get lost, then we can begin to actually see or recognize kind of we're heading into those situations at times. Now, some of those, like your boss walking into your office, or the phone ringing, those things happen suddenly. But at the same time, if you begin to recognize, when my boss walks into my office, I lose awareness, then that kind of recognition may help you to recognize when your boss walks into your office, to be clearly aware, oh, it's happening. Just like be curious about in that moment what goes on, not to try necessarily, this is a difference in daily life again, not to try necessarily to hold on to awareness there, but more be curious about what arises, what happens in those moments that just takes you away from mindfulness. Maybe with your boss walking in, there's some anxiety that arises, and or a performance kind of thing that comes up, something that comes up there. Or when the phone rings, maybe there's the idea of, oh, it's going to be this person, and that's where we launch out. So just be curious what happens. That can create the conditions for more seeing, for more kind of recognition of what's going on, what's arising in those moments that takes us out. So this, I'll bring this back now to that moment of mindfulness returning. When we think about continuity, and I often talk about continuity as being an extended period of time of mindfulness, and certainly encouraging that kind of cultivation of a momentum across time. That's that kind of momentum of mindfulness is where the learning happens. And yet when we have that idea of continuity as being, a long stretch of time, we may discount the continuity that can happen in little bursts. We may kind of think that I have to work at being mindful for hours before any kind of wisdom or understanding will arise. I certainly had that belief. I had that view in my mind at times. And yet one thing I've seen is that moment of mindfulness returning, that moment when mindfulness arises. Like if you have noticed that you tend to lose awareness with a particular mind state, like anger, or you lose awareness when your boss walks into your office, the moment that mindfulness returns, when that state of mind happens, or when that event happens, sometimes in that moment of mindfulness returning, there's like this burst, like what I call a burst of continuity. You get like 2 or 3 seconds of really clear mindfulness when mindfulness returns. Sometimes, especially if you're not judging yourself for the fact that mindfulness had been gone. So in that moment, sometimes there's a burst of continuity to really see what's going on in that moment. So I'll give an example. I'll try to keep this brief because I know many of you have heard this before, but I was working with this kind of practice around anger and noticing when anger was present, because I could see I just got completely lost in anger. And so I set this intention to, I'm going to notice when I'm angry, and we can use intention here. So set an intention. I want to notice when my boss walks into my office. I want to notice when the phone rings. Kind of noticing those areas where mindfulness gets lost, we kind of set an intention to notice those times. So I was doing this with anger. And over the course of, several months, I began noticing the mindfulness with the anger, usually a little bit after the fact. At the beginning, that mindfulness would return after I'd been angry for a little while. And so, there was just a slow kind of learning, a gradual learning over a couple of months of seeing what was going on around the anger, the beliefs, the views. A lot of learning happened with this very simple practice. This is actually my first mindfulness practice. Can I be mindful when anger is happening? And then at one point, because I'd spent so much time, noticing anger, noticing that anger was suffering, noticing the pain of it, those were some learnings that I was experiencing. At one point there was the kind of shock of, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to make the other person miserable, but it's making me miserable first. And so just really noticing and learning what anger was and how it functioned and how it made me feel. And then one day, I was in my kitchen. I was just doing some things, and I wasn't particularly trying to be mindful. I was just preparing a meal, cutting an apple. And as I cut that apple, a memory arose about the person I was angry with. I saw the memory arise. And I saw in that moment, so in that moment, that seeing, it's kind of like the mindfulness arose. That was the moment of mindfulness returning when that memory arose. Cutting the apple, seeing the memory arise. Mindfulness returned in that moment. So that noticing, oh, mindfulness is returning. I'm aware of this memory. And in that return of mindfulness in that moment, there was the little burst of mindfulness. It lasted for a few seconds. The mind saw in that moment the memory. It saw the kind of, the mind kind of jumping onto that thought. It's like the intention, not the anger yet, but the intention to think more thoughts in order to get angry. The mind saw that kind of momentum. It felt like a freight train, this like, like I want to get angry. That was the momentum in the mind. And seeing that again with this burst of continuity, none of this was anything that I did. Seeing that momentum of the mind wanting to get angry, having spent a lot of time getting to know how much suffering anger was for this body and mind, the wisdom arose in that moment. And I wouldn't have phrased it as this at the time. I was only 2 months into practice or something. I didn't really have this language, but wisdom arose and said, you don't need to do that. Don't go there. That doesn't make any sense to get angry because it's going to be painful. And so the wisdom created the conditions for the anger to vanish, for not to vanish, to not arise, because the anger had not arisen by that point. It was the momentum towards the anger that the awareness had noticed, not the anger itself. And again, I think this was partly because I had spent so much time in the terrain of noticing anger that Carol Wilson uses this phrase, get to know the smell of something coming. It was like in that moment, the mind, the awareness recognized the smell of anger coming. And it was just like, yeah, don't go there. That doesn't make any sense. And so there was that moment of the non-arising, recognizing that anger did not arise. And the seeing of that non-arising created this huge flush of gratitude and appreciation. And it's like, wow, this practice works. There's this moment of like recognizing this is a path. This is a way forward. I had been so torqued out by my anger. I didn't know there was any way to step out of it. And that moment, that little burst of continuity, 3 seconds of mindfulness, created the conditions for that seeing. And so those moments of mindfulness returning, even in the midst of daily life, can result in a lot of deep seeing and deep understanding. So the kind of this checking or noticing those moments or those places where mindfulness tends to get lost. And in my case, in the beginning of my practice, noticing I tended to get completely lost into anger. So setting that intention, I want to be aware when anger happens. And it's not something, to try to like force into, but, have some curiosity. That curiosity, I think, was really my friend there. Can I be curious? Can I recognize when anger arises? And then, just noticing the moments of the return of mindfulness. And that moment of the return of mindfulness was a moment of deep seeing, of a lot of clear seeing and understanding. Now, it wasn't the end of my anger by any means, but it was the sense of understanding this is a path, this is a way to understand my mind. So yeah, noticing those moments when mindfulness gets lost and noticing those moments of the return of mindfulness, if you're working with those during your daily lives, there will be a lot of understanding that can arise for you. It's not just about doing it, for the sake of, being a good meditator. It's for the sake of learning about your minds and understanding how suffering is created and how it can be released with this practice. This is the reason the Buddha taught this. It's possible to have freedom from these reactive habits and patterns. It's possible to be free from greed, aversion, and delusion, but not without some practice and curiosity and investigation, cultivation of mindfulness and wisdom. So Dawn, do you want to add anything about effort and continuity and mindfulness in daily life?
Sure. A couple of things come to mind. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. The first is, as you were just speaking, I really appreciated implicitly hearing something that I want to highlight for people, kind of lift up for people. Hang on, sorry, I'm distracted by seeing myself. I'm going to put it on gallery. And that is that moment of recognition, like I don't have to get on the train, or, I don't have to buy into the train. This is going to be unpleasant, is also a moment of the First Noble Truth. Wow, this is dukkha. And that another way of framing what you just said about recognizing that this is a path is I heard there was a certain kind of faith that got lit up. And so to just add that language to where when you do notice these wholesome moments in response to just a moment of seeing arising, to appreciate them, to take note of them, because they are onward leading on this path, as Andrea is suggesting. So that's a big piece. And then the second piece, and apologies, Andrea, if you're planning on introducing this later, but another area on past daily life retreats with Andrea that I've found helpful is to pick one or two activities in the day to intentionally hook with your awareness. So brushing your teeth, washing the dishes, opening the door, answering a phone, and to really, if you're already doing that, to lean into it just a little bit at this point in the retreat, and maybe add one more if it's working. Because what happens then is the conditionality she's speaking of works both ways. The awareness can pop up in the middle of an activity seemingly randomly. It can also pop up because we've brought awareness to the activity in the past. So feel free to say more about that, Andrea. I just wanted to introduce the practice again.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. I think we'll leave it at that for now. Yeah, sometimes we have to pick and choose what to bring in, but I'm glad you brought it in. Yeah, I'm going to remove your spotlight. Yeah, let's see. There's a couple of questions kind of related to effort and an attitude that I want to just touch on before we take a break. One was a question directly, can you speak to effort and attitude? It seems like effort can reveal an attitude, and noticing an attitude can reveal a flavor of effort being made. Both of those are true. As I said in the guided meditation, not only can it reveal an attitude, or that an attitude can reveal the flavor in the effort. Looking at the attitude can free up energy for the effort, because greed, aversion, and delusion takes a lot of energy. It's quite amazing how much energy they take. And when they're kind of operating in the back of the mind, they're consuming energy. And so when they're seen, and it's like, now they're seen, it's like that energy that was going into feeding them is now available to kind of be brought to the mindfulness. So, the checking the attitude can be a great support for this kind of light touch of effort. And then, if it feels like the effort we're making is a struggle, if it feels like it's hard to make effort, that's a good time to check the attitude. Because often when it feels like there's a struggle, there's some kind of view or perspective or maybe belief or some greed or aversion going on that is kind of, catching us in not necessarily being seen. So there's a lot of interplay there. And I think it's just useful to explore, how is it for you? There's more ways, I think, than I can describe in the moment of how these two can be seen interplaying. And there's they're going to be varied. It's going to be different depending on what your situation is and what the conditions are. And then a couple of questions on, here's one that's kind of more related to effort. I use dropping questions in my practice, especially with challenging energies or emotion. Is there such a thing as too many questions? And so, this is, I talked about this in the guided meditation or mentioned it in the guided meditation, that we can use these light questions as a support for effort in a way. What supports us to stay present? And it might just be a recognition, aware. We're already aware. So questions, using wisdom, reflections, these things can support us in making the effort. They can help to balance the mind. They can help to create conditions for the mind to be able to be more stable or balanced, or to just simply recognize what's here. This is a piece of the tool of the practice Sayadaw recommends. It doesn't have to happen. You don't have to use these questions or dropping things in like this. Like he did early on, particularly, was teaching, am I aware of what, what's obvious, and what's my attitude? Those questions were really highlighted in my early days of practicing with him. But for different people, those using questions can be a kind of a hook to thinking. And if that's what's happening for you, that's not so helpful. So you need to have some wisdom around how to use these questions and how to use these wisdom reflections. And they can also be a great support. The piece around, is it possible to ask too many questions, is kind of like along the lines of what I pointed to with the scooter analogy. If there's a momentum of mindfulness already, there's already a noticing, you're already with experience, then bringing words in may get in the way of that momentum. Like I said, if you're already going pretty, smoothly on the scooter, putting your foot down and tapping is going to, create a slowdown. And so we need to tune our use of the questions, tune our use of the wisdom reflections to the momentum. And I find often when there is a strong momentum, a judiciously placed question can be really powerful, because sometimes there can be a lot of momentum and there's a seeing of what's going on, but then a simple questions in those times, like, anything else here? Something that can kind of highlight, there's a lot of momentum, so a lot of capacity to meet what's here, but sometimes our mind is habitually oriented to meeting certain kinds of experience. And so that kind of question, anything else here, can broaden or open the mind to something else that may be able to be seen with that momentum of mindfulness. So there's not a one answer to this question. Is there such a thing as too many questions? Sometimes there is too many questions. It depends on the momentum. It depends on the conditions. Sometimes a lot of questions can be really helpful if there's a time of the mind being really struggling with something. those questions and those wisdom reflections can be so supportive to help the mind actually be present. And so what I encourage you to do is to notice, is it helpful to ask the questions? Is it, and helpful meaning, does it create the conditions for you to actually be more present? Or does it create the conditions for you to start thinking about things? If that's what's happening, then you might want to back off on the questions. So there's a kind of a nuanced answer to that question. So let's take a break until 12 after the hour, or 42 after the hour, depending on what time zone you're in. See you in a few minutes.